My mother was halfway through carving the anniversary roast when she laughed and told the table, for maybe the thousandth time in my life, that I was never really theirs. My father smiled into his wine glass like it was an old family joke. My sister, Olivia, didn't even look up. Around us, silverware clinked, candles flickered, and 20 people sat in perfect, polished silence, the kind of silence rich families mistake for class. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out a hospital record from St. Mary's dated 26 years ago, and set it right beside my mother's plate. The room changed before anyone said a word. You can feel that kind of change like the air pulls tight. My father's face strained first. My mother's hand stopped moving. The knife slipped against the china with a sound so small it should have meant nothing, except suddenly, it meant everything. Because printed in black ink, under attending physician, delivery room, mother of infant, was her name. Patricia Blake. And under live birth, female child, was the truth they had spent my entire life burying. In that moment, nobody reached for bread. Nobody checked their phone. Nobody rescued them. For the first time in 26 years, the lie did not own the room. The document did. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with the story and drop a comment. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? My name is Savannah Blake. I'm 26 years old. And for as long as I can remember, my parents told people I was not their real daughter. Not in a dramatic movie scene kind of way. Not with shouting. Not with slammed doors or broken picture frames. My family was too careful for that. Too polished. Too respectable. No, they did it with a smile. With a laugh. With that tone adults use when they want to humiliate you, without looking cruel. At church picnics, neighborhood parties, holiday dinners, school functions, even graduation brunches, they would find ways to say it. Savannah's story is a little different. She came to us in an unusual way. Olivia is our only biological child. Sometimes they made it sound charitable, like I should have been grateful for a seat at the table at all. Sometimes they made it sound funny, like I was some long-running family anecdote everyone already understood except me. And when I was little, I actually believed there had to be something wrong with me for it to feel so bad. Because when adults repeat the same thing for years, and everybody around them chuckles awkwardly and changes the subject, you start to wonder whether pain is just proof that you are too sensitive. I learned early not to ask questions in public. I learned not to ruin birthdays, not to bring tears to Thanksgiving, not to make things uncomfortable. That phrase lived in my house like a third parent. Don't make things uncomfortable. Don't make guests uneasy. Don't ask why Olivia got the big party at 16 while I got a grocery store cake and a card signed in a hurry. Don't ask why her college fund existed in a neat little account and I was told I'd build character applying for grants. Don't ask why family photos were arranged so she stood in the center and I hovered at the edge, half-turned, like someone who had wandered into the frame by accident. Don't ask why my father would clap Olivia on the shoulder and call her my girl, then look at me with that cool, measured expression and say, Savannah's independent. Independent. That was the label they gave me instead of loved. It sounds flattering if you say it right. It sounds almost noble. But in my family, independent meant unattended. It meant don't expect help. Don't expect softness. Don't expect the same. The strangest part is that my parents never committed to one version of the lie. Sometimes they implied I was adopted. Sometimes they suggested there had been some private family arrangement they were too decent to explain. Once, when I was 14 and one of my friends asked why I didn't look less like them if I wasn't really theirs, my mother laughed and said, well, genetics can play tricks, honey. I remember that moment more clearly than I remember prom or senior year or my first apartment. Because something in me went still. I looked at her, then at my father, waiting for one of them to realize they had gone too far, waiting for somebody to say enough. But nobody did. My father just kept eating. And Olivia smirked into her sweet tea. That was the year I stopped asking for rides. The year I stopped expecting my birthday to matter. The year I started saving every paycheck from my part-time job in a little envelope hidden inside an old shoebox because I understood something before I had language for it. If I ever wanted stability, I was going to have to create it myself. So I did. I got good at paperwork because paperwork did not gaslight me. Dates stayed where they were printed. Names did not shift because someone at the head of the table felt powerful. Numbers did not soften themselves to protect a family image. Records either matched or they didn't. Facts either held or they broke. And over time, that became my safe place. Not love, not home, documentation, procedure, traceable truth. Maybe that sounds cold. Maybe it is. But if you grow up in a house where the story changes depending on who is listening, the cleanest comfort in the world is a form filled out correctly in black ink. Even so, there were moments, quiet little cracks in the version of reality they built, that never left me. My grandmother, Ruth Holloway, saw more than she said. She was my mother's mother, soft-spoken, silver-haired, always smelling faintly of lavender and old books. She was not the kind of woman who made scenes. She would never have challenged my parents in front of a room full of people. But once, when I was about 10, I heard her say to my mother in the kitchen, very low, very calm, "Then why does she have your eyes?" I wasn't supposed to hear it. Maybe she knew I did. My mother answered too fast, too sharp. "Ruth, not this again." Again. That word lodged in me. Again meant the question had come up before. Again meant someone else had noticed. Again meant maybe I wasn't crazy for feeling the shape of something hidden under all those years of polished cruelty. I carried that tiny, fragile possibility with me into adulthood like a match I was afraid to strike. Because what if I was wrong? What if the story was exactly what they said it was, and I was just the pathetic girl who wanted to belong badly enough to invent hope? So I did what I always did. I kept my head down. I worked. I built a life that did not depend on my family, approving of my existence. I rented a small apartment 40 minutes away. I paid my own bills. I bought my own furniture, one practical piece at a time. I became the kind of woman people describe as composed, which is a flattering way of saying I learned to survive disappointment without showing it on my face. But the lie never stopped. Even at 26. Even now. Especially now. Because the older I got, the more their story hardened into identity. It wasn't just something they said. It was the role they assigned me in the family ecosystem, tolerated outsider, permanent maybe, the girl who should always be grateful and never quite comfortable. And if I had done what they expected, I would have kept carrying that role forever. Smiled at the wrong moments. Stayed quiet at the right ones. Let them narrate my life until there was nothing left of me except whatever version was easiest for them to explain over dinner. But that night, with crystal glasses catching the candlelight and Olivia pretending not to watch me and my father preparing to tell one more charming lie in front of one more audience, I already knew something they didn't. I had the file in my bag. I had the date. I had the record. And before that dinner was over, the story they had told about me for 26 years was going to collide with something far more dangerous than my anger. It was going to collide with proof. If you had met my family from the outside, you probably would have thought I was imagining things. That was the genius of people like my parents. They never looked cruel in a way strangers could easily name. My father, Daniel Blake, was the kind of man who held doors open, remembered first names, and sent expensive sympathy flowers when someone in town had a loss. My mother, Patricia, knew how to host a table that made people feel flattered just for being invited. Linen napkins, polished silver, candles that smelled faintly like vanilla and cedar. Everything arranged so carefully that you almost felt rude noticing what was wrong underneath it. And what was wrong underneath it was me. Or at least that was how they trained me to see it. Olivia, my younger sister by 3 years, was the center of every room before she was old enough to understand what a center was. She had blonde hair that my mother called sunshine, and a laugh my father treated like proof that the world was still decent. When she was 10, she wanted writing lessons, so she got writing lessons. When she was 12, she wanted a room makeover in soft blue with custom shelves and a hanging chair in the corner, and somehow that happened too. When she turned 16, there was a catered backyard party with string lights, a live acoustic singer, and a silver SUV with a red bow parked in the driveway like something out of a commercial. I remember standing near the dessert table that night, holding a paper plate with a slice of cake I did not even want, and hearing one of my father's business friends say, "You really go all out for your girls." My father smiled and put a hand on Olivia's shoulder.
"For my daughter," he said.
Just daughter.
Singular. Clean.
Uncomplicated. I was 14 then, old enough to hear what was not said. Old enough to notice that no one corrected the sentence. My 16th birthday was different. My mother bought a cake from the grocery store on her way home because she had forgotten to order one. The frosting was too sweet and the plastic decoration still had the price tag on the bottom when she set it on the counter. Olivia was at dance practice. My father was late from work. We did not even sit in the dining room. We stood in the kitchen under the bright overhead light that made everyone look tired, and my mother said, "Let us make this quick. We still have to pick up Olivia." She handed me a card with $20 inside and called it a starter gift, as if there was more coming later. There never was. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was too mature to care about parties, too practical to need a car with a bow on it, too independent to want the kind of fuss that always seemed to appear so naturally for Olivia. That is how I survived in that house. I translated neglect into character development. I turned disappointment into a personality trait. I made myself smaller and called it strength. Even our chores told the truth my parents would never say plainly. Olivia was asked
To help.
I was expected to handle. She set the table if guests were coming. I scrubbed the pans after everyone ate. She forgot laundry in the dryer, and my mother laughed about how scatterbrained she was. If I forgot anything, I got that cool, disappointed look and a lecture about responsibility. She could leave a mess in the bathroom, and it was brushed off as teenage chaos. If I left a book on the coffee table, it became evidence that I did not respect the home I had been given.
Given.
That word again, always hovering over me like a reminder that my place in the family was conditional, borrowed, subject to review. And the money. The money said it louder than anything else. Olivia's school tuition was an investment. Mine was a burden to be discussed. When she wanted to tour colleges out of state, my parents turned it into a weekend trip with hotel reservations, brunch stops, and photos in front of brick buildings covered in ivy. When I got accepted into a state school with solid scholarships, my father asked whether community college might be more realistic, considering my circumstances. My circumstances. He said it the way a banker might discuss risk. I can still see the legal pad on the kitchen table where he had written numbers in neat rows. Tuition.
Books. Housing.
Transportation. He tapped the page with his pen and said, "We have to be strategic. We cannot treat every child's future exactly the same." Not every child. Every child. I noticed that too. He was careful never to say I was not included in the category. He just structured the sentence, so I understood I was the adjustable line item. The extra. The one whose future could be negotiated downward without anyone having to admit what they were doing. So I worked. I babysat. I stacked inventory at a pharmacy on weekends. I took every shift I could get over the summer, saving money in amounts too small to feel meaningful until one day they added up to enough for a used laptop and a deposit on a dorm room. My mother praised me for being self-sufficient, as if she had nurtured it in me, as if self-sufficiency had not been forced into my bones by years of being told not to need things. That was another one of her gifts.
She
could wound you and then admire the scar as if she had done you a favor. There were other differences too, quieter ones, more humiliating because they were so deniable. Family pictures over the fireplace showed Olivia at every age in matching silver frames. Her dance recital, her middle school graduation, her horseback competitions in pressed white pants and polished boots. There were pictures of me too, but fewer, smaller, placed off to the side like visual footnotes. On Christmas mornings, Olivia had stockings that overflowed. Mine was neat, modest. Toothpaste.
Socks.
Maybe a bookstore gift card if my mother had remembered I liked to read. At Thanksgiving, Olivia was encouraged to sit and talk with guests because she was so charming. I was sent back into the kitchen to help keep things moving. I do not think anyone in my extended family ever sat down and decided, together, to treat me as less.
I think it was worse than that.
I think they absorbed the hierarchy because my parents radiated it so consistently. People follow emotional cues more than they realize. If the hosts of the home act like one daughter is the future and the other is a complication, most guests fall in line without ever saying so out loud. But Grandma Ruth did not. Not fully. She noticed what plates were set where. She noticed who got called into a room to be admired and who got called in to carry something. Once, when I was 17, she found me washing dishes after one of Olivia's birthday dinners. My hands were pruned from hot water and my mascara had smudged under my eyes because I had cried in the downstairs bathroom for exactly 3 minutes, then fixed my face and come back out. She stood beside me for a moment, drying a serving spoon with a dish towel. "You always disappear after these things," she said softly. I shrugged and kept scrubbing. Some people are easier to celebrate than others. The second I said it, I hated myself for how bitter it sounded. But Grandma Ruth did not correct me. She did not say that was not true. She only looked at me with an expression I could never fully name, part sadness, part recognition, like I had finally said aloud something she'd been carrying in silence for years. "No," she said after a pause long. "Enough to matter. Some people are easier to neglect." I stopped moving. Just for a second. The water kept running. The spoon in her hand caught the light. And in that tiny, ordinary kitchen moment, something shifted in me. Not enough to heal anything. Not enough to make me brave. But enough to tell me I was not inventing the pattern. Enough to prove that at least one person in that family saw the same system I had been living inside since childhood. After that, I started paying closer attention. Not in the emotional way I had as a kid, always wondering what I had done wrong. In a different way, a colder way, I began noticing dates, statements, contradictions. My mother's changing version of how I came into the family. My father's carefully vague phrasing. The way both of them became irritated whenever details were requested. It was still just instinct then. A low hum under everything. I did not have proof. I did not even know what I was looking for. I only knew this. Lies that survive for years usually do so because people are too tired, too young, too dependent, or too afraid to test them. And little by little, without saying it out loud, even to myself, I was becoming none of those things. By the time I left for college, I had stopped hoping my family would suddenly become honest with me. Hope in that house was expensive. It asked for energy I could not afford to waste. So, I traded it for something more useful. Precision. I became the kind of person who read every line before signing anything, who saved receipts, who remembered dates without trying, who noticed when somebody changed a detail in a story and expected no one to catch it. People love to romanticize resilience, but most resilience is not beautiful when it is forming. It is repetitive. It is lonely. It is learning how to stand in a room where affection is rationed and deciding that if warmth is not available, accuracy will have to do. College was the first place I understood how unusual my instincts had become. My roommate, Claire, was the sort of girl who trusted people naturally. She left her debit card on her desk without thinking twice. She forgot due dates because she assumed reminders would work out. She called her mother 3 times a day about things as small as laundry soap and dinner plans. The first time I heard that kind of ease in someone else's voice, I actually froze in the hallway outside our room. Not because I was jealous exactly.
It was stranger than that.
I was disoriented. I had spent so many years calibrating myself to tension that ordinary trust sounded almost reckless. Meanwhile, I built systems. I color-coded deadlines. I kept copies of financial aid forms in a labeled accordion folder. I tracked work-study hours in a spreadsheet and cross-checked my pay stubs down to the dollar. If a professor changed a syllabus date verbally, I wrote it down immediately. If the bursar's office posted a fee I did not recognize, I asked for the breakdown. I was not obsessive because I liked control. I was careful because somewhere deep down, I had learned a terrible lesson very young. When people decide your reality for you, the only defense is documentation. That instinct shaped more than school. It shaped what I studied, where I worked, even how I moved through the world. I did not pick a glamorous major. I picked something practical, stable, something connected to systems that had rules and records and a paper trail. By my junior year, I was working part-time in administrative support for a regional medical office. Insurance, verification, patient forms, intake corrections. It was not exciting, and that was exactly why I liked it. Nobody there cared about family mythology. Nobody cared who got more love at Thanksgiving. A name either matched a date of birth or it did not. A billing code was either entered correctly or flagged for review. It was quiet, orderly, almost tender in its predictability. Sometimes I would sit at my desk looking at a chart and feel calmer than I ever had in my parents' dining room. That sounds sad when I say it out loud, but it is true. There is comfort in environments where reality cannot be managed by charm. After graduation, I took a full-time role in patient records compliance at a hospital network 40 minutes from where I grew up. It was not glamorous then either. It still is not. But it taught me something that changed the way I looked at almost everything. Records have lives. They move. They are created by one person, handled by another, archived, transferred, corrected, sometimes misfiled, sometimes rediscovered. And every time they move, they leave traces, timestamps, initials, department codes, routing histories. People think the truth is always dramatic when it finally appears. Most of the time it is administrative. Most of the time it is hiding in plain sight under a date stamp and a barcode. That thought stayed with me more than it should have, especially when it came to my own history. I still went home for major holidays. Not because I wanted to, but because absence would have become its own accusation. In my family, if I pulled back, they would not have asked what hurt me. They would have used my distance as evidence that I had always been the difficult one. So I appeared when required. Easter brunch, Christmas Eve, Olivia's engagement dinner, my father's birthday, my mother's carefully staged charity lunch in the spring before I turned 25. I learned how to arrive with a neutral expression, compliment the table setting, carry one dish to the kitchen, and avoid being alone with Patricia too long. My mother always did her best work in corners, where cruelty could sound conversational. You look tired, Savannah. Are you still at that records job? Olivia has such natural grace in rooms like this. None of it was severe enough to quote later, without sounding petty. That was her talent. Death by 1,000 polished little cuts. My father was easier to read because he believed distance made him dignified. He rarely said anything directly unkind. He preferred implication. He would ask how my apartment was in the tone people use for temporary housing. He would nod when I talked about work, then change the subject to Olivia's fiancé, Nolan, and his promising career in commercial real estate. If guests were present, he introduced me with a pause that never quite landed in the same place. This is Savannah. Or, Savannah is with us. Not daughter. Never daughter unless the context demanded it. And even then, it sounded borrowed. Like language he was willing to rent for an evening if social etiquette required it. Olivia, somehow, had grown into the exact role the house trained her for. She was not cartoonishly cruel. That would have been easier to confront.
She was breezy about it.
Entitled in a way that read as confidence to anyone who did not know the architecture underneath. She would lean over at family dinners and say, "Do you remember when Mom used to tell people you were our mystery add-on?" Then laugh like she was giving us all a nostalgic anecdote. Or she would say, "You always were the practical one. I got the genes for charm." Sometimes she said things so outrageous, I nearly admired the nerve. Once, after too much white wine at a rehearsal dinner tasting, she looked at me across the restaurant table and said, "Honestly, if you are not biologically one of us, that might explain why you are the only person in this family who reads directions." Everyone laughed. Even Nolan gave that uncomfortable half-smile people wear when they know something is off but do not want to challenge it in public. I laughed too. Not because it was funny. Because I had spent years understanding that the quickest way to survive humiliation is sometimes to act like you are in on it. But later that night, driving home alone with both hands tight on the steering wheel, I heard Grandma Ruth's voice in my head. Some people are easier to neglect. Not easier to celebrate. Easier to neglect. The difference mattered more as I got older. Because celebration can be subjective. Neglect is structural.
It repeats.
It leaves patterns. It organizes a household. And once I started thinking that way, I could not stop. I remembered details that had not made sense when I was younger. My mother once snapping at a family friend for asking where I had been born. My father insisting certain old boxes in the attic were private financial records and not to be touched. The way both of them shut down any conversation about my infancy faster than they shut down anything else. If I asked normal questions about Olivia's baby photos, the mood stayed light. If I asked anything about mine, even as a joke, the air changed. It did not happen dramatically. It chilled. That was all. A small temperature drop. A pause too long. A glance exchanged across the table. The kind of reaction most children miss because they do not yet know how revealing silence can be. I knew by then. I had been raised inside silence. I knew what it protected. Around that same time, Grandma Ruth's health began to decline. Not suddenly. Gradually, in the way families pretend not to notice at first because naming it would make it real. She repeated stories, forgot names for a moment, then found them again, moved more carefully, sat down more often. My mother handled it the way she handled everything that threatened the image of seamless control, by becoming brisk, efficient, impatient with weakness dressed up as concern. Olivia sent flowers and called herself devoted. I started visiting on Sunday afternoons, not out of duty, out of instinct, because something in me had begun to feel that time around my grandmother mattered, even if I could not yet explain why. We would sit in her den with iced tea and thin lemon cookies she barely touched. Sometimes we talked about ordinary things, gas prices, television, a neighbor's new roof. But every now and then, there would be a pause. One of those heavy, waiting pauses that feels almost sentient. And I would catch her looking at me with that same expression from years earlier. Sadness, recognition, a kind of restrained urgency, as if she had spent too long holding a truth that was pressing against the edges of her silence. One Sunday near the end of summer, rain tapped softly against the windows while she sorted through a tin of old photographs on the coffee table. I reached down to help gather a few that had slid onto the rug, and she put her hand over mine. Her fingers were cool and light, but the grip was surprisingly firm. "Savannah," she said, very quietly, "have you ever asked yourself why your mother hates details?" I looked at her, not answering right away, because the question was too precise to be casual, too deliberate.
My heartbeat changed.
Not faster exactly, sharper. She released my hand and looked toward the rain-dark glass. "People who tell the truth usually do not mind details," she said. "It is only liars who need everything kept vague." Then she fell silent again, as if she had already said more than she intended to. I did not push. I wanted to.
God, I wanted to.
But years of surviving my family had taught me something else too. Push too hard at the wrong moment, and people retreat behind politeness, denial, and selective memory. So I waited. I picked up the scattered photographs one by one. I stacked them carefully, and all the while one thought settled into me, with a weight I could not shake. I had spent most of my life wondering whether there was something wrong with me. But what if the better question, the truer one, was this: what exactly were they so afraid I would find? For the next few weeks, I could not stop hearing my grandmother's question in my head. "Why does your mother hate details?" It followed me into the grocery store, into traffic, into the fluorescent quiet of my office where printers hummed and keyboards clicked, and everything looked normal enough to make a person doubt herself. But I had spent too many years being trained to doubt myself. By then, I knew the feeling of a real instinct. Real instincts do not beg for attention. They sit still. They wait. They return. I started visiting Grandma Ruth more often after that Sunday, sometimes twice a week if my schedule allowed it. I told myself I was helping, bringing soup, changing a light bulb, sorting mail into neat little stacks on the kitchen counter. And some of that was true, but there was another truth underneath it. I was listening, not in the dramatic sense. I was not digging through drawers or interrogating an elderly woman for secrets. I was listening for the shape of what she knew and the shape of what she had spent years refusing to say directly. Her house felt different from my parents' house in a way I had never been able to explain as a child. It was smaller, older, less impressive by every material measure. The carpet was worn in the hallway. The wallpaper in the guest bathroom had started to peel at one corner. The kitchen cabinets were painted a soft cream that had faded unevenly over time. But it was the only place in my family where I never felt edited. Grandma Ruth did not perform warmth. She simply made room for it. If I was quiet, she let me be quiet. If I spoke, she listened all the way to the end of a sentence. People underestimate what that does to a person who grew up being interrupted. One Tuesday evening in early fall, I stopped by after work with takeout from a diner she liked. Turkey sandwich on wheat for her. Chicken soup and crackers, because she said soup always tasted honest. I set everything on the table while she folded and unfolded the same napkin in her lap, distracted in that drifting way she had sometimes lately. Outside, the sky had gone that heavy gray that makes 4:30 feel like evening. Inside, the lamp beside her chair cast a warm little pool of light over a stack of unopened mail, reading glasses, and a blue tin I had seen before but never paid much attention to. We ate slowly. She asked about work. I told her about a ridiculous records request that had somehow bounced between 3 departments because no one wanted to admit they were missing a transfer form from 1998. She gave a faint smile. That sounds about right, she said. People lose things all the time. Then they spend years protecting the loss instead of fixing it. The sentence landed harder than she seemed to intend. I looked up. She kept stirring her soup. Did you ever know a family, I asked carefully, that lied so long they forgot where the lie ended? She did not answer right away. That had become her pattern when something mattered. Silence first. Not avoidance. Measurement. She set down her spoon, folded her hands, and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Families do not usually forget, she said quietly. They just get comfortable being obeyed.
I felt that in my chest.
Not because it was dramatic, because it was precise. My family had always relied on obedience more than belief. They did not need me convinced. They only needed me compliant. They needed me tired enough, ashamed enough, outnumbered enough, that I would stop asking them to make sense. Did you know? I asked.
About me.
I mean, really know. Her eyes moved to the blue tin on the table and stayed there long enough for me to notice. Then she reached over and rested her fingertips on the lid. I knew something was wrong with the story, she said. That is not the same as knowing everything. I did not move. Even the refrigerator seemed suddenly louder. What was wrong with it? Her face changed then. Not into fear exactly. More like old sorrow pulling itself up from someplace deep and tired. Your mother was never consistent, she said. When you were little, if someone asked you directly, she would say one thing. A year later, she would say another. Temporary guardianship, then a private arrangement, then some nonsense about complicated circumstances. She always wanted the mystery without the specifics. And your father, she paused, her mouth tightening just slightly. Your father treated vagueness like strategy.
That sounded exactly right.
So exactly right that for a second, I had to look away. Rain had started against the windows again, soft and steady, turning the porch light into a blurred yellow smear across the glass. Why did nobody stop them? Asked before I could stop myself. The question came out younger than I meant it to. Not 26. More like 10. Or 14. Or 16 in the kitchen under the bright overhead light with a grocery store cake and a mother too rushed to pretend convincingly. Grandma Ruth heard the age inside the question. I could tell. Because people tell themselves a child is resilient, she said. Because they tell themselves it is not their place. Because some people care more about preserving peace than protecting truth. And because your parents are very good at making anyone who challenges them feel uncivilized. There it was. The whole architecture in one sentence. My parents did not win because they were right. They won because they made honesty look rude. I stared at the tabletop for a while, at the grain of the wood, the ring left by an old water glass, the edge where the finish had worn down smooth over time. Did you ever ask her directly? I said. Many years ago. She answered so fast that I knew she had been expecting that question for a long time. And she gave a dry little laugh with no humor in it. Patricia told me I was being intrusive. Daniel said the matter was private and that I was upsetting the household. Upsetting the household. Of course. In my family, truth was only welcome if it arrived quietly and agreed to leave the hierarchy untouched. Anything else was labeled disruption. Anything else became bad manners. Grandma Ruth lifted the lid of the blue tin then, but only halfway, as if she had not fully decided whether to continue. Inside I saw old photographs bundled with a ribbon, a few yellowed recipe cards, and what looked like folded hospital paperwork. My pulse flickered. She noticed. Her hand stayed on the lid. I keep things, she said softly. Not because I am sentimental. Because when people start rewriting history, saved things become important. I do not think I breathed for a second or two. What is in there? She did not hand it to me. Not yet. Instead, she drew out a photograph and placed it on the table between us. It was old, slightly bent at one corner. The colors faded into that soft brownish tint pictures get when they have lived too long in drawers. A hospital room. Pale curtains. Harsh overhead lighting. My mother in bed, much younger, hair damp against her forehead, not camera-ready, not composed. Vulnerable in a way I had never seen her in real life. And in her arms, wrapped in a pink-striped blanket, was a newborn baby. The date stamped in the corner was the year I was born. I looked up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. Is that Olivia? I asked, though I already knew it could not be. Olivia was 3 years younger. Grandma Ruth's eyes held mine.
No, she said. Just that. No.
The room seemed to narrow around the word. I looked back down at the photograph. My mother was not smiling the way she smiled in posed family pictures. She looked exhausted. Protective.
Claimed.
There was a hospital bracelet on her wrist, though the image was too grainy to read. I touched the edge of the photo with one finger, afraid of damaging it, afraid it might somehow dissolve if I acknowledged what it was suggesting. Then who is it? I whispered. Grandma Ruth leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since I had started visiting her more often, she looked not confused or tired, but absolutely certain. I believe, she said slowly, it is you.
Silverware.
I actually think my mind rejected the sentence before my body did, because the first thing I felt was not relief. It was resistance. 26 years of being told one story does not vanish in a second just because another story finally knocks on the door. You believe, I repeated. You're not sure. She gave a small nod. I am careful with certainty, but I am sure enough to say this. Your mother gave birth in a hospital. I saw her before and after. I visited. I brought flowers. There was a baby. Then, later, there was a different explanation every time someone asked a direct question.
My
hands had gone cold. Why would they do that? It was the most obvious question in the world, and somehow still impossible to answer. Grandma Ruth closed the tin gently. That, she said, is the part one never fully knew. She looked at me for a long moment, and her voice softened. But Savannah, I need you to understand something. A lie that lasts this long does not survive by accident. It survives because it is serving someone. We sat there in silence after that. Real silence. Not the brittle, punishing kind from my parents' dining room. This silence held weight, but it also held permission. My eyes drifted back to the tin, the folded papers inside it, the photograph still lying between us like a match struck in a dark room. I did not ask to take anything home that night. Not because I did not want to. Because I knew enough from my own work to understand that truth becomes stronger when handled carefully. Chain of custody. Originals.
dates.
Context. Even in the middle of the shock, some practical part of my brain had already awakened. The same part that had saved receipts and tracked forms and built a life out of documented facts. I looked at my grandmother and asked the only question that made sense now. What else did you keep? Grandma Ruth did not answer me right away. She looked down at the blue tin in her lap as if it had suddenly become heavier, as if the years inside it had gathered actual weight. Then she lifted it carefully and set it between us on the coffee table. "Not much," she said, though the way she said it told me that in families like mine, not much could still be everything. She drew out the folded papers first, smoothing them one by one with the flat of her hand. They were not full medical records. I knew that immediately.
Too thin.
Too incomplete. But they were hospital-adjacent, the kind of documents people keep without realizing what they might one day prove. A discharge instruction sheet with St. Mary's logo at the top. A pink carbon copy slip with a room number handwritten in fading ink. A gift shop receipt for flowers, and a plush rabbit dated the week I was born. And then, tucked between two recipe cards, a tiny rectangle of cardstock with rounded corners, the kind of card hospitals used to place in bassinet cribs for newborns. Most of the writing had faded, but one line remained visible enough to make my pulse stumble. Mother P. Blake. Infant. Baby girl Blake. I stared at it so long my eyes started to blur. "You kept this?" I asked. Grandma Ruth gave a small, almost apologetic nod. It was tucked into one of the flower envelopes after the hospital. I do not think Patricia realized it was there. I picked it up with both hands, as if steadiness could change what I was seeing. Baby girl Blake. Not unidentified infant. Not temporary placement. Not private arrangement. Baby girl Blake. The words were simple, administrative, ordinary. That was exactly why they hit so hard. Lies that survive in families often sound big and emotional. But truth, real truth, is usually boring at first glance. A label.
A date. A signature.
A slip of cardstock no one thought to destroy. I set the card back down very gently. "Did you ever confront them with this?" I asked. No, she met my eyes. By the time I found it again years later, the story had already hardened. And I did not know enough to accuse anyone of anything specific. I only knew I did not believe them. There was no defensiveness in her voice. Just regret. Old and settled. I understood that kind of regret. It does not usually come from cruelty. It comes from people realizing too late that silence is not neutral just because it feels polite. We spent the next hour going through the rest of the tin slowly, carefully, the way people handle items in an estate sale when they are looking for history and not decoration. There were photographs of my mother pregnant, though only one or two, and never displayed anywhere in my childhood home. There was a shower invitation with Patricia's maiden name printed in blue script. There was even a note from a church friend that said, "Cannot wait to meet your little girl." Not your little girls. Not your family's edition. Your little girl. The closer I looked, the less plausible my parents' story became. Not because one document proved everything. It did not. But because all the surrounding details formed a shape, and that shape looked nothing like the version of my life I had been fed for. 26 years. Before I left that evening, I asked if I could take photos of everything with my phone. Grandma Ruth hesitated for half a second, then nodded.
Yes.
But do not tell your mother I have these. That sentence did something strange to me. It made me feel 12 and 30 at the same time. 12, because secrets in my family always carried risk. 30, because for the first time I understood that the adults had been managing fear too, just in quieter clothes. I photographed every item twice, once wide, and once close.
Dates.
Logos. Handwriting. Edges. I turned on timestamp backup the way I would for any work-related documentation. When I finished, Grandma Ruth touched my wrist lightly. "Savannah," she said, "whatever you do next, do it carefully. Truth is not always enough on its own. It needs structure." I almost laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because that sentence sounded exactly like the life I had built. Structure. Records. Sequence. Verification. Maybe that was why I had survived as well as I had. Maybe some part of me had always been preparing for the day when emotion alone would no longer be enough. Over the next 10 days, I did not confront anyone. That surprised even me. 20-year-old Savannah might have rushed home with a shaky voice and a photograph in her hand, desperate for some dramatic confession that would finally make the pain make sense. But 26-year-old Savannah knew better. People who lie for decades do not fold because you arrive with one good question. They improvise. They redirect. They make you sound unstable. They use your hurt against you. If I was going to do this, I was not going to do it like a wounded child begging to be told the truth. I was going to do it like someone who understood systems. So I started with what I knew I could verify. St. Mary's Hospital had changed ownership twice since I was born, but records from the old campus had been consolidated into the larger network years ago. I did not use my employee access. That would have been wrong, and besides, improper access would only taint anything I found. Instead, I spent my lunch breaks reading public policy pages, retention schedules, medical records, request procedures, archival transfer notes. I made a list. Birth records, labor and delivery logs, discharge, summaries, nursery registration. Anything that might still exist in some preserved form if the retention category had been extended or microfilmed before digitization. Most people think searching for truth feels cinematic. It does not. It feels like tabs open on a browser. It feels like hold music. It feels like coffee going cold while you compare policy language from 3 different years. And all the while, regular life kept moving. Olivia's wedding planning accelerated into a full family occupation. My mother texted group updates about florist deposits, tasting menus, seating charts, napkin samples in shades of cream so similar they looked identical to me. My father sent one message about a postponed rehearsal dinner meeting and signed it as always, Dad and Patricia, as if even in a family thread he could not quite let himself be simply my father. I responded with neutral thumbs-up reactions and short confirmations. Nothing in my messages suggested the axis of my life had tilted. Then came the invitation that changed the pressure of everything. My parents were hosting a formal anniversary dinner at the country club in honor of 30 years of marriage. Immediate family, a few close friends, select relatives, business associates Daniel liked to impress. My mother called it intimate, which in Patricia Blake language meant expensive and highly curated. The event was scheduled for 3 weeks away on a Saturday night. Cocktail attire, private dining room, printed menus, a string quartet during the reception hour. I read the message twice and felt my stomach go cold, because I knew exactly how evenings like that worked. My mother would be radiant. My father would be gracious. Olivia would glow in whatever pale dress had been chosen to flatter her skin tone under warm lighting. And at some point, usually after the second glass of wine, but before dessert, somebody would ask some harmless question that opened the familiar door. How old were your girls when you joined the club? Or, Daniel, which one of them got your eyes? And then the lie would come out again. Lightly. Socially. With a laugh. I could feel it before it happened because repetition has its own weather. For the first time in my life, I did not dread that possibility because it would hurt. I dreaded it because now I knew the lie had edges. Evidence made old humiliation sharper, not softer. It transformed every memory from vague cruelty into something more deliberate. It was one thing for parents to favor one child. It was another to build an entire narrative around erasing the reality of another child's origin. 2 days later, I received a call at work from a woman named Megan Whitmore in archival services at the hospital network that had absorbed St. Mary's. I had submitted a formal inquiry as a private citizen requesting guidance on legacy maternal birth documentation connected to my own year of birth. I had kept the request narrow, factual, careful. Megan's voice was calm, efficient, the kind of voice I trusted instinctively because it did not perform empathy for effect. Ms. Blake, she said, some historical records from the old St. Mary's campus were indexed under partial migration. I cannot release anything without the proper request process, but I can tell you there may be responsive material if you are able to verify next of kin or legal interest. I sat up straighter in my chair. Responsive material, I repeated. Meaning birth-related records? Potentially, she said. I would need to be careful with wording until identity is confirmed. Careful with wording. God, I loved careful people. My fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of confirmation would you need? She listed the requirements. Government, identification, date of birth, a notarized records request, supporting context if there had been a historical discrepancy in familial documentation. Historical discrepancy in familial documentation. That phrase settled over me like the first clean breath after years of stale air. I wrote everything down. After the call ended, I sat at my desk staring at my notes until the words blurred. Then I opened my calendar. The anniversary dinner was in 16 days. 16 days until my mother would stand under candlelight and talk about family as if she had not spent decades poisoning the meaning of that word for me. 16 days until my father would toast loyalty and legacy in a room full of people he had trained to see me as an asterisk. I looked at the date. Then I looked at the copy of the faded bassinet card photo in my phone. And for the first time, the thought came to me not as anger, not even as revenge, but as a clean and terrifying possibility. By the time we all sat down at that long polished table, I might finally have something they could not smile their way out of. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to a strip mall 2 towns over to get my records request notarized. It was the kind of place people forget 10 minutes after leaving. A shipping store between a nail salon and a discount pet supply shop. Fluorescent lights. A bell over the door. A woman in a navy cardigan who barely glanced at me before sliding the clipboard across the counter. Ordinary. Entirely ordinary. And somehow that made the moment feel even bigger. Because for most of my life, the central lie of my existence had lived in expensive rooms, under polished lighting, inside carefully chosen words spoken by people with social power. But the first real step toward undoing it happened in a place with bubble mailers hanging on a rack and a handwritten sign advertising passport photos for $14. I signed where I was told to sign. Printed my full name in block letters. Showed identification. Watched the notary stamp press red ink into paper with a firm, mechanical finality that almost made me emotional. There is something about official process when your life has been shaped by emotional manipulation. Process does not flatter anyone. It does not soothe egos. It does not care who usually wins at the dinner table. It asks for names, dates, signatures, and authority. That was a language I trusted. Afterward, I sat in my car for a full minute, request packet in my lap, engine off, watching a woman push a shopping cart through the parking lot while a little boy beside her dragged one untied sneaker against the pavement. Somewhere in another version of my life, I thought, maybe this would have felt dramatic. Maybe I would have cried or called a friend or stared into the distance while music swelled. But real turning points rarely announce themselves that way. Most of the time, you're just in a Honda Civic in a cracked parking lot, holding papers that may or may not change everything, wondering if your hands are trembling because you are scared or because, for the first time, fear and hope feel almost identical. I overnight the request packet to the archival processing office Megan Whitmore had listed. Then I went straight to work because there were claims to review and correction. Queues to clear, and people in the real world do not get to suspend adulthood every time their private history starts to split open. Still, I could feel the request traveling through the day with me like a second heartbeat. I kept checking the time. Not obsessively. Just enough to know when the overnight courier would scan it in. Just enough to imagine someone in a records facility touching an envelope with my name on it, opening it, and stepping into the ruins of a story my parents had guarded for 26 years. At lunch, I walked out to the employee courtyard and ate half a sandwich without tasting it. The October air had that thin crispness that makes metal benches cold through your coat. Around me, 2 nurses were discussing pumpkin patches for their kids, and a pharmacist was laughing into his phone about football bets. Life kept sounding normal.
That almost offended me.
How could the world remain so calm when the foundation of mine was under review? Then again, I had learned this early too. The world does not pause just because a family secret is reaching its expiration date. 3 days passed before Megan called back. 3 long, strangely stretched days during which my mother texted me 6 times about the anniversary dinner and once about Olivia's wedding favors, as if ivory ribbon versus pearl ribbon were the sort of emergency that should command my emotional bandwidth. I answered every message politely. I said the napkins looked lovely. I told her the menu choices sounded elegant. I even responded to Olivia's smug little note in the family thread about wanting the anniversary dinner to feel intimate and truthful, which nearly made me laugh out loud in the middle of my office. Truthful.
My family loved words like that.
Legacy.
Grace.
Loyalty. They wore them the way some people wear perfume, hoping nobody would notice what they were covering. When Megan finally called, I was in my apartment folding laundry, a fitted sheet half inside out in my hands, socks unmatched on the couch. The utterly unglamorous scenery of a life I had built without help. "Miss Blake," she said, "I have reviewed the preliminary archive index. There are responsive materials." I sank onto the arm of the sofa, so quickly the sheet slipped to the floor. "What kind of materials?" I asked. My voice sounded steady. I was absurdly proud of that. "I still cannot release the documents verbally," she said in that calm, exact tone I had come to associate with competence. "But I can tell you the file cluster appears to include maternal admission records, labor and delivery documentation, and nursery registration associated with the date and hospital campus you provided." For a moment, I could not form a reply. Not because I did not understand her, because I understood her perfectly. Maternal admission, labor and delivery, nursery registration, administrative phrases, plain phrases. But there was no interpretation of them that matched the story I had been raised on. I forced myself to ask the next question like a professional, even though my pulse felt loud enough to interfere with reception. "Are the records connected to Patricia Blake?" A pause.
Small.
"Careful. The file cluster is associated with the family identifiers you submitted," Megan said. She was protecting process. I knew that, and I respected it. But in that answer, there was enough. More than enough. I pressed my fingers against my forehead and shut my eyes. "What happens now?" "Now we complete authentication and release protocol. Because these are legacy records and there appears to be a discrepancy issue, I would prefer to handle this in person if possible. That reduces the risk of fragmented release." Of course it did. Fragmented release. One wrong page too early, one misunderstood notation, and families like mine could wriggle through ambiguity for another decade. "I can come in," I said immediately. "Tomorrow, if needed." She gave me a time and an address for a records annex attached to one of the newer hospital buildings 25 minutes from my apartment. Not the main hospital. Not someplace cinematic. A lower brick structure with archive storage, legal release processing, and compliance offices. Again, truth was refusing to stage itself elegantly for me. Again, I loved that about it. The next day, I wore a black sweater, navy slacks, low heels, and the expression I reserve for meetings where I expect something difficult, but not chaotic. I brought my identification, copies of the photograph materials from Grandma Ruth's tin, and a notebook I knew I might not be able to write in if the moment hit me too hard. The annex lobby smelled faintly, like printer toner and lemon disinfectant. A television mounted in the corner played a daytime talk show with the volume off. A fake ficus tree stood near the reception desk. Megan Whitmore came out to meet me in person after 10 minutes. She was in her early 40s, maybe, with chestnut hair pulled back in a low twist and the kind of composed face that suggests she does not waste language.
No dramatic sympathy.
No performative concern. Just directness. "Savannah?" she asked. I stood. "Yes." She shook my hand once and led me down a quiet hallway into a conference room with a rectangular table, 2 padded chairs, a tissue box, and a sealed document envelope lying in the center. My eyes went straight to the envelope. Not because I expected magic. Because I knew enough to recognize controlled release packaging. She sat across from me and folded her hands. "Before we open this, I need to explain the limits of what the record does and does not prove." I nodded. "Understood. Historical records can contain clerical anomalies," she said. "However, the cluster we located appears internally consistent. We found a maternal admission record under Patricia Blake's name on your birth date. We found a labor and delivery summary associated with that admission. We also found a nursery registration entry for a live-born female infant assigned as baby girl Blake before final name entry. There is no notation in the file cluster suggesting external placement, adoption transfer, or unidentified maternal status." She said it cleanly.
No embellishment.
No pause for effect. But each sentence felt like a strike against stone that had been standing over me for years. No notation suggesting external placement. Adoption transfer. Unidentified maternal status. The lie had lived inside implication. These records lived inside absence. The absence of every claim my parents had made. Megan opened the envelope and turned the documents toward me one at a time. First, the admission record. Patricia Blake.
Date. Time.
Attending physician. St. Mary's Women's Pavilion. Then the labor summary. Length of labor. Delivery notes. Female infant. Stable condition. Then the nursery registration sheet with temporary designation before final infant naming. And there, in typed text that looked almost insultingly plain, was the linkage I had never been allowed to claim out loud. Mother, Patricia Blake. Infant, female. Family designation, Blake. I did not cry. That surprises people sometimes when they imagine moments like this. But tears would have required softness, and what I felt first was not softness. It was impact. A brutal, clarifying impact, like realizing you had spent half your life bracing for weather that had actually been engineered indoors. Megan slid one final page toward me. This was filed under supplemental newborn identification. It was a footprint card. Tiny inked newborn footprints, the kind hospitals take in those first hours after birth. Beside them, maternal identifiers. I stared at the black swirls of those impossible little feet and felt something in me drop all the way to the bottom. Not because the footprints proved a relationship emotionally, because they were real in a way my parents' version had never been. Tangible, dated,
Stored.
preserved. My entire life, they had treated my existence like a vague and slightly embarrassing footnote. But here I was.
Inked. Logged.
Entered into the world under my mother's name. Do you need a moment? Megan asked. I looked up at her. Somewhere behind my ribs, grief and fury were beginning to sort themselves into something colder, more useful. No, I said. Then, after a beat, because honesty had started to matter to me in a new way, I added, actually yes, but not before we finish. She gave the smallest nod, the kind competent women give each other when they understand that a person can be wounded and still want the facts first. So we kept going. We reviewed release copies, certification language, document handling, and what could be notarized if I needed formal presentation. I asked about chain of custody. She explained. I asked whether the record cluster had any indications of amendment. It did not. I asked whether the identifiers were consistent enough to survive challenge in a family dispute over historical narrative. She chose her answer carefully. These are authentic institutional records, she said. People may still deny them emotionally, but administratively, they are clear. Administratively, they are clear. I will never forget that sentence, because my family had always relied on emotional fog, hurt feelings, social pressure, vague phrasing, memories too slippery to pin down. But the records were clear. When I finally walked back to my car with the certified copies in a manila envelope against my chest, the sky was that cold, bright blue you only get in late fall, when everything looks sharp enough to cut. I stood by the driver's side door, without unlocking it. The envelope was not heavy, but my arms felt it anyway. For 26 years, my parents had owned the story. In less than an hour, a woman in a quiet annex building had handed me the first thing strong enough to take it away from them. And all I could think, as the wind moved through the parking lot and dried leaves scraped softly across the pavement, was this. They had 16 years of my childhood, 10 years of my adulthood, hundreds of dinners, thousands of comments, a whole social world arranged around their version of who I was. And now, in my hands, I held something terrifyingly simple. Proof. I did not go straight home after leaving the records annex. I drove without music, without calling anyone, without even turning on the navigation because I needed the familiar roads to feel unfamiliar for a minute. I needed the world to stop looking arranged. The envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me, angled toward the dashboard, plain manila, legal size, sealed again after review with a label across the flap. If you had glanced through my windshield at a red light, you would have seen nothing dramatic. Just a woman in traffic on a Thursday afternoon, hands at 10 and 2, hair slightly flattened from the wind, expression unreadable. But inside that car, There were at least 3 versions of me trying to speak at once. The little girl who had spent birthdays trying not to ask for too much. The teenager who laughed on cue when people made me into a family anecdote. And the adult woman who now had institutional proof that the story shaping all of it had been a lie. By the time I parked outside my apartment building, the sky had started to fade into that washed-out silver you get before early winter evenings close in. I carried the envelope upstairs with both hands, as if care itself could keep me from breaking open too quickly. Inside, my apartment looked exactly as I had left it. A mug in the sink, a throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch, a stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. That steadiness saved me. There is mercy in ordinary surroundings when your inner life is trying to tilt. I set the envelope on the table and stood there for a long moment without touching it. Then I took off my coat, washed my hands, poured a glass of water, and sat down like I was beginning a meeting. That was how I had to do it. Not like a daughter, like a woman reviewing evidence. I opened the envelope again and spread the copies across the table in a clean line. Admission record, labor summary, nursery registration, supplemental newborn identification, footprint card. I read every line twice. Not because I doubted them, because some part of me still could not understand how something could be this clear and still have been denied for so long. Patricia Blake, mother, female infant, Blake family designation, no transfer,
No edaption, no tastion.
no ambiguity unless a person wanted ambiguity badly enough to manufacture it. And my parents had wanted it very badly. That was the thought that hollowed me out more than anything else. Not that they had lied once in a moment of panic. Not that there had been some mistake that spiraled. This had taken maintenance, repetition, mutual agreement, social choreography. They had built a version of my life and then fed it to rooms full of people until even I started swallowing it. I sat there until the light outside dimmed and the apartment reflected back at me in the darkening window. More than once, I picked up my phone. More than once, I thought about calling my mother immediately and saying the words out loud just to hear what happened. I have the records. I know what you did. But every time I imagined the call, I could hear the mechanics of the response before it even happened. Patricia would go cold first, then offended. Daniel would step in with that low, measured tone he used when he wanted to make emotions sound like instability. They would say there had to be context. They would say medical paperwork can be confusing. They would accuse me of misinterpreting private family matters. They would make my certainty carry all the burden while they hid inside vagueness, the same way they always had.
No.
A phone call would give them air,
Space.
time to regroup, time to decide which version of the lie to try next. I was done offering them private rooms to rearrange reality in. Still, not confronting them right away did not mean I was calm. It meant I was strategic. There is a difference. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was wondering whether the records were real. I knew they were real. Megan had made that impossible to doubt. What kept me awake was the question underneath them.
Why?
Why tell everyone I was not their real daughter if I was? Why build an entire family culture around my displacement? Why let Olivia grow up absorbing that hierarchy like sunlight? Why make me earn scraps of acknowledgement under a roof where my existence had been documented from day one? I turned those questions over until 2 a.m, then 3, then sometime after, for I got out of bed and stood barefoot in the kitchen with a blanket around my shoulders, staring at the envelope on the table again like it might answer on its own. It did not. Paper rarely tells you motive. It tells you what happened. Motive is the messier work. Friday at work, I functioned because function had become muscle memory for me years ago. I reviewed discrepancies, corrected identifiers, answered 2 emails from compliance and 1 from a physician's office that had faxed the wrong release form for the 3rd time. My hands moved. My brain worked. But beneath all of it, something had shifted. I realized, almost with embarrassment, how much of my emotional architecture had still been built around my parents' authority even after I had become independent. I did not rely on them financially. I did not ask them for approval. I did not even enjoy being around them. And still, on some buried level, I had been living as though they had the final say over what my life meant. The records had ended that. Not the pain of it, not the history, but the ownership. They no longer owned the central story. That belonged to the documents now. Friday evening my mother called while I was in the grocery store comparing two different brands of coffee filters. Of all the absurdly ordinary settings for that call, somehow that one fit. I watched her name light up my screen and let it ring twice before answering. Mum. Savannah, where have you been all day? She said, not hello, not how are you, just immediate possession of the tone. I sent you 2 messages about the seating chart. I glanced at the row of filters in front of me and felt something inside me go very still. I was working. Well, Olivia and I need a response. We moved you closer to the end of the table since Nolan's parents need to sit near Daniel. There it was again. The tiny public demotion wrapped in logistics. Not even personal enough to qualify as cruelty if repeated later. Just arrangement. Placement. Social management. My mother had always been brilliant at arranging people in ways that reflected how she thought value should look. That is fine, I said. I am sure you have a system. Please do not be sharp, she replied instantly. I am trying to make this evening special for everyone. Everyone. I almost laughed. Instead I looked at a box of coffee filters, so hard the printed logo blurred. Of course, I said. You always do. She did not catch the meaning under it. Or if she did, she ignored it. She launched into napkin rings, floral height, whether I could arrive 15 minutes earlier to help direct older relatives toward the private dining room. I said yes to everything.
Calmly, smoothly.
She hung up satisfied. And that, more than anything, told me I had made the right choice not to confront them early. My mother was still moving through the world, as if control naturally belonged to her.
Good.
Let her. There is power in letting people underestimate how close the floor is to dropping beneath the version of reality they curated. Saturday afternoon I drove to see Grandma Ruth. I had called first, and she sounded more tired than usual, but clear. When I arrived, she was in her den with a cardigan around her shoulders and the television on mute. I sat across from her and placed the certified copies on the coffee table. She looked at my face before she looked at the papers. You found them, she said softly. It was not a question. I nodded. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then I slid the labor summary toward her. She put on her glasses and read in silence, her eyes moving more slowly than they once had but still sharply enough to land on what mattered. When she reached the nursery registration sheet, she closed her eyes. Not dramatically, just briefly, as if an old suspicion had finally stopped being lonely. I am sorry, she said. The words were so quiet I almost missed them. For what? I asked, though I knew. For not doing more when you were little. For seeing enough to worry and still not tearing the whole thing open. I shook my head before she even finished. You were the only one who kept anything. Her mouth tightened. Keeping and protecting are not the same. No, I said. But they are not nothing either. She looked at me for a long time then, and whatever she saw seemed to settle something in her. What are you going to do? She asked. I wish I could say, I answered immediately, with the kind of clean certainty that makes for a satisfying story. But the truth is I did not know. The anniversary dinner was a week away now. I had the records. I had the copies from her tin. I had more than enough to understand the truth, and nowhere near enough to understand the motive. Part of me wanted to walk away entirely. To cut ties, block numbers, mail back every holiday card they would ever send, and let the silence speak for itself. Part of me wanted a private confrontation with just Daniel and Patricia, no audience, no spectacle, just a locked room and the demand that they explain themselves for once without witnesses to perform for. But the deepest part of me, the part that had been shaped by 26 years of public humiliation disguised as family humor, knew something I was only beginning to admit. The lie had not been private. It had been social.
Public.
Repeated in dining rooms and church halls and patios and school events and bridal luncheons and every polished gathering where my parents relied on charm to turn my pain into ambience. And, because the lie had been made public, some dark, clean instinct in me wanted the truth to arrive there too. Not for revenge. At least that is what I told myself. But maybe there was some revenge in it. Or maybe it was not revenge at all. Maybe it was proportion. Maybe I simply wanted the correction to happen in a room large enough to hold the damage. Grandma Ruth reached for my hand and squeezed once. "Whatever you do," she said, "do not do it because you still want them to choose you." The sentence landed with terrible accuracy, because until that moment, I had not fully realized how much of my hesitation still came from the child part of me that wanted this to end with understanding, with repentance, with my mother breaking down and saying she had always loved me in some damaged, distorted way, with my father finally using the word daughter like it cost him something. I looked at the records on the table, at the precise lines, the dates, the ink, the unembellished truth of institutions that had no interest in soothing me. And in their coldness, I found something unexpectedly merciful. They did not ask me to hope. They only asked me to see clearly. When I left Grandma Ruth's house that evening, dusk had already settled. Porch lights blinked on up and down the street. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a child laughed in a backyard. Ordinary life, again. I sat in my car with the engine running and the heater blowing warm air against my hands, and I finally said the sentence out loud, just to hear whether it sounded true. I do not need them to love me. The inside of the car held the words without echo. I tried again. I need them to stop lying about me. That was it. That was the decision. Not reconciliation. Not emotional closure. Not one more private conversation where I would walk in with facts and walk out with their confusion draped over me like a burden I somehow had to carry.
No.
I would not ask them quietly. I would not let them shrink the truth back down into a family misunderstanding. They had built the lie at tables, under chandeliers, in front of witnesses. So, when the time came, I would bring the truth to a table too. Once I made the decision, everything became quieter. Not easier. Quieter. That is an important difference. Easier would have meant relief, some sense that the worst part was over, because I finally had proof. But quiet meant the panic had burned off and left strategy behind. I knew what I was doing now. I was not going to storm into my parents' house with shaking hands and a stack of papers. I was going to build the kind of structure they could not laugh away. By Monday morning, the anniversary dinner was 6 days out. I went to work, logged into my system, answered 2 routine emails, and then used my first break to step outside with my phone and call Megan Whitmore. She picked up on the second ring. "Archival Services, this is Megan. It is Savannah Blake. I thought I might hear from you," she said, and there was no curiosity in it, only recognition.
I appreciated that.
Recognition without intrusion is rare. "I need to ask you something specific," I said. "If someone challenges their records verbally in a family setting, what is the clearest way to describe what they establish without overstating anything?" She was silent for half a beat, not because the question shocked her, but because she was choosing accuracy. "You can say the institution's archived maternal and newborn records identify Patricia Blake as the mother connected to the live birth on your date of birth. You can also say there is no archival notation supporting outside placement or adoption transfer in the file cluster we reviewed." I wrote the sentence down word for word. "Can I quote that language?"
Yes.
"But if you intend to present the documents publicly, I would stick to what is directly visible on the certified copies and avoid speculation about motive." Of course she would say that.
And, of course she was right.
Motive was where liars hit. Facts were where they slipped.
"One more thing," I said.
"If someone claims the records were amended later, are there indicators of that?" "There are fields and coding patterns that usually show amendment history. We did not see those in what was released." My pen stopped moving for just a second. "We did not see those." Again, careful language. Again, enough.
"Thank you," I said.
"You have been more helpful than you know." "I am glad the records were clear," she replied. "Clarity matters." After I hung up, I stayed outside another minute in the thin, cold air, notebook open against my palm. Clarity matters. That sentence joined the others in me like a set of steel beams. Administratively, they are clear. Truth needs structure. I was building something now. Not a confrontation. A framework. That evening, I spread everything across my dining table again, but this time I organized it the way I would for a formal review. Certified hospital records in one stack. Photographs and preserved materials from Grandma Ruth's blue tin in another. My notes from Megan. A third page titled Only. With one question: what can they still deny? The answer was obvious and infuriating. They could deny motive. They could deny memory. They could deny intent. But they could not deny that Patricia Blake's name was on a maternal admission record linked to my birth. They could not deny the labor documentation. They could not deny the nursery registration. They could not deny the footprint card. Emotionally, yes, people can deny almost anything. But denial is not the same as credibility. That distinction mattered to me more than I can explain. For 26 years, my family had used emotion as if it outranked reality. If Patricia looked offended enough, people backed off. If Daniel sounded calm enough, his version became the respectable one. If Olivia rolled her eyes and called me sensitive, that was somehow treated as evidence against me. I was done living in that system. So I built a new one for that table. Not on paper exactly. In sequence. First, let them speak. Then, if the lie appeared, ask one clean question. Then place the certified records down. Then read only what could be read.
No accusations.
No speech. No trembling explanation that invited debate. Just record.
Date. Name.
Mother. Infant. No transfer notation. If they wanted to implode after that, they could do it on their own time. Midweek, Olivia called me while I was driving home. I almost let it go to voicemail, but answered out of habit. Hey, she said, drawing the word out like we were close in a way we had never actually been. Mom is spiraling over the seating chart. Please tell me you are not going to be weird on Saturday. I kept my eyes on the road. Weird how? She laughed softly. You know what I mean. Do not come in all intense and make everything heavy. This dinner actually matters to people. Actually matters to people. It was such a perfectly Olivia sentence, I almost admired the efficiency of it. I was not planning to make anything heavy, I said. Good, she replied. Because Nolan's parents will be there and a few of Dad's clients, and honestly, I do not want one of your moods turning into family theater. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, just once. Family theater. That was what they called it when my pain became inconvenient to the production. You do not have to worry, I said. I know exactly how to behave at a table. There was a brief silence on the line, as if something in my tone had brushed against her without fully landing. Then she moved on to floral runners and menu cards and hung up cheerful, untouched, still living inside the assumption that she understood the hierarchy of our family and that it would remain permanently in her favor. I got home and sat in my parked car for a while after the engine stopped. It struck me then that Olivia might genuinely have believed the lie. Or, at least the version of it that benefited her. Golden children are often raised inside mythology too. The difference is that mythology wraps them in privilege instead of excluding them from it. I did not know whether she had ever questioned our parents privately. I did not know whether she cared. And by that point I realized it almost did not matter. My obligation was no longer to interpret everyone else's conscience for them. My obligation was to tell the truth clearly when the moment came. Thursday night, I went to see Grandma Ruth one more time before the dinner. I had not intended to bring the folder, but I did. She was awake, though tired, with a blanket over her knees and a lamp on beside her chair. The house smelled faintly of chamomile tea and old paper. I sat across from her and told her my plan. Not dramatically. Just plainly. If they say it again in front of everyone, I am going to place the records on the table and read them. I will not shout. I will not argue. I will not let them turn it into a private misunderstanding. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I trusted her more than anyone in my family. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment and asked, "Are you ready for the possibility that they still will not explain themselves?" I looked down at my hands. The answer was no. Of course it was no. No one is ever fully ready for the people who shaped their childhood to fail one final, obvious test. But ready or not had stopped being the point. I think I am ready for them not to own the room anymore, I said. A softness passed. Over her face then. Not happiness. Something steadier. Respect, maybe. That is enough, she said. Before I left, she asked me to open the drawer in the end table beside her chair. Inside was a cream-colored envelope with my name written on the front in her careful, slanted handwriting.
Take this, she said.
Not for the dinner. For after. I started to protest, but she shook her head once. After, she repeated. I slipped it into my bag, without opening it. The drive home felt longer than usual, though the roads were familiar. Every red light seemed brighter. Every storefront seemed too ordinary for the week I was living through. By Friday afternoon, the day before the anniversary dinner, I had become almost unnervingly calm. I steamed my black dress, polished my low heels, set the manila folder inside my bag between two hardcover notebooks so it would not bend. I printed one extra copy of the key record pages and sealed them in a separate envelope that I left at home, just in case. Not because I expected disaster. Because contingency planning is what people like me do when life has taught them that truth can be fragile in careless hands. Around 7 that evening, my father called. He rarely called me directly unless logistics were involved. Savannah, he said in his usual composed tone, your mother tells me you are coming tomorrow. Such a strange sentence. As if my attendance at a family event required independent verification. Yes, I said. I will be there. Good. A pause. Then, it should be a lovely evening. Let us all do our part to keep it that way. I leaned against my kitchen counter and closed my eyes for one slow breath. There it was. The family mission statement. Let us all do our part. In other words, help us maintain the version of reality that flatters us. I plan to be very calm, I said. The words were true enough to be almost funny. Excellent, he replied, relieved by something he thought he heard in my voice. That is all anyone can ask. After he hung up, I stood in the quiet apartment with my phone still in my hand and felt a strange, piercing clarity settle over me. My father thought calm belonged to him. My mother thought presentation belonged to her. Olivia thought social ease belonged to her. They had no idea that by Saturday night, calm was going to belong to me. Because calm is not the same as surrender. Sometimes calm is what truth sounds like right before it speaks. I arrived 11 minutes early, exactly as my mother had requested, and the country club already looked like the kind of place people used to prove they belonged to one another. Soft gold lighting. Tall arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus. Waitstaff moving quietly between linen-covered tables with the polished efficiency of people trained to make expensive evenings feel effortless. At the entrance to the private dining room, a framed sign in cream calligraphy read celebrating 30 years of Daniel and Patricia Blake, and beneath it, in smaller script, family, legacy, gratitude. I stood there for one still second with my bag on my shoulder and the folder inside it pressing lightly against my side, and I thought, of course those were the words.
Family.
Legacy. Gratitude. My mother was near the bar directing two servers with the calm intensity of a woman who believed aesthetics were a moral virtue. She turned when she saw me and did that fast visual sweep she always did, taking in my dress, my shoes, my hair, my expression, evaluating whether I was presentable enough to be associated with her. Good, she said instead of hello. You are on time. Please help your Aunt Linda find her seat when she gets here, and do not leave your bag sitting anywhere visible. I almost smiled at that. Of course, I said. She did not notice the meaning under it. Or maybe she did not imagine there could be one. My father arrived a few minutes later in a charcoal suit, warm from the parking lot, and already wearing the expression he saved for public events, half gracious host, half man who expected rooms to settle themselves around him. He kissed my mother on the cheek, nodded at me, and said, Savannah, glad you made it. Glad you made it. As though I were a junior employee who had managed traffic well. I would not miss it, I said. Again, true enough to pass unnoticed. Olivia came in glowing the way women glow when they have been loved too publicly for too long to know what unearned light looks like. Her fiancé, Nolan, followed with one hand at the small of her back and a bottle of wine for the gift table. She air-kissed my cheek and said, Thank you for not wearing black. Mom was worried. I looked down at my dress, dark but soft, structured but unremarkable. I am always happy to lower the family's stress levels where I can. She laughed because she thought I was joking. That was the strange luxury of that evening. For once, my calm made them careless. Guests filtered in over the next half hour. My Aunt Linda and Uncle Howard. Two couples from church. One of my father's oldest clients and his wife. Nolan's parents, elegant and blandly approving. A retired judge my mother adored mentioning in conversation because it made her dinner parties feel more important. Everyone entered the room already inclined to think well of my parents, and I could feel the old dynamic waiting beneath the evening like a polished floor under a rug. They were the center. Olivia was the golden extension. I was useful if quiet, acceptable if pleasing, tiresome if otherwise. The seating chart confirmed it. My mother had placed me near the far end of the long table between Aunt Linda and one of Daniel's business friends. Not quite hidden, but certainly not central. Olivia and Nolan were near my parents. Nolan's parents, just beyond them. The retired judge to Patricia's right. Family as hierarchy disguised as hospitality. I took my seat with my bag resting against my chair leg and noticed that the place cards simply read Savannah, while Olivia's read Ms. Olivia Blake and Nolan's read Mr. Nolan Mercer. Petty, deniable, ridiculous. Also deliberate. The kind of detail only someone like my mother would believe did not count. Cocktail hour bled into dinner with all the smooth, curated ease I had known my whole life. Glasses filled. Silverware lifted. Waiters placed courses in perfect synchronization. My father stood for a toast before the entree and spoke about commitment, partnership, weathering life together, building a family with intention. That phrase nearly took the air out of me. Building a family with intention. Around the table, people smiled, nodded, reached for stems and crystal. Patricia looked down modestly at her plate in that rehearsed way she had, as if receiving praise embarrassed her just enough to make it convincing. Then she stood for her own remarks and thanked everyone for joining them, thanked Olivia for being such a joy in every season, thanked Nolan for loving our girls so well, thanked dear friends who had become family. When she got to me, she turned with that bright, controlled smile and said, "And Savannah, thank you for always being so self-sufficient and understanding about how complicated family stories can be." There it was. Not the full lie. Not yet. Just the door opening. A few people smiled politely. Aunt Linda looked down into her wine. Nolan's mother tilted her head in vague confusion. My pulse did not jump. It slowed. "Of course," I said, because the moment had not arrived. Not yet. Dinner continued. Salad plates disappeared. The main course arrived. My father told a story about the early years of his business. Olivia laughed too loudly. Patricia corrected a waiter over a sauce placement so gently he probably thanked her for it. Across the room, a server adjusted the flame on two pillar candles near the sideboard. The quartet had stopped playing, and now only the small sounds of a formal dinner remained. Glasses touching the tablecloth. Forks against china. The low drift of socially approved conversation. I remember all of that because when a life changes in a room, the room becomes strangely vivid. I remember the exact color of the roses. I remember the retired judge asking whether Olivia had always been the expressive one. I remember my mother laughing and saying, "Oh, Olivia has always been unmistakably ours." Then she took a sip of wine and almost lazily, like a woman brushing lint from silk, added, "Savannah's story is a little more unusual. We have always tried to be very gracious about it." The table gave the polite little reaction people give when they sense something private has been hinted at, and they're being invited to treat the hint itself as sophistication. Someone smiled uncomfortably. Someone reached for water. My father lowered his eyes with that false humility he used when he wanted silence to do his work for him. And Olivia, without even looking at me, said, "Our family has always had layers." A little laugh. The kind that says, "Do not worry. This is old and settled and not worth examining." For one suspended second, I was 26 and 14 and 10 all at once. Every holiday table. Every half joke. Every introduction that paused just short of the word daughter. But underneath all of it now was something new. Not hurt. Structure. I set my fork down. Not loudly. Just enough that the tiny sound reached the people nearest me. Then I looked at my mother and asked, with all the calm I had promised my father, "What exactly have you been gracious about?" The room did not freeze. Not immediately. People rarely recognize the beginning of collapse while it is still wearing manners. My mother gave a soft laugh. "Savannah, this is not the time." "No," I said. "Actually, I think it is exactly the time." My father's expression shifted by 1 degree. Only one. But I saw it. The first flicker of irritation beneath the public mask. "Let's not make a scene," he said quietly.
Scene.
There was the family word for truth spoken outside approved boundaries. I reached down beside my chair, opened my bag, and took out the folder. Nothing dramatic.
No flourished.
I placed it on the tablecloth beside my plate and opened it with both hands. My mother went still, not confused. Still. That was how I knew, before a single page turned, that some part of her recognized what was coming. Olivia finally looked at me directly. "What are you doing?" she asked, half annoyed, half amused. I pulled out the first certified copy and laid it flat on the table. Then the second. Then the third. The small official seals caught the candlelight. Around us, conversation collapsed in quiet pieces. "I am correcting the family story," I said. No one moved. My father's voice came low and warning. "Savannah." But the old tone did not land. Not anymore. I touched the top page with one fingertip, steady enough to surprise even me. "This is a certified maternal admission record from St. Mary's Hospital on my date of birth. It lists Patricia Blake by name." I heard someone inhale softly across the table. My mother's hand tightened around her napkin. "This is inappropriate," she said, but her voice had already lost the easy social texture it usually wore. I did not look at her. I looked at the page. "This is the labor and delivery summary connected to that admission. Female infant. Stable live birth." My father leaned forward slightly. "You do not understand what you are reading." There it was. The first defense. Not denial of the document. Denial of my competence. It would have worked once. Years ago. Not now. I lifted the next page. "This is the nursery registration. Temporary infant designation. Baby girl Blake. Family identification linked to Patricia Blake." Across from me, Nolan's mother slowly set her glass down. The retired judge was staring at the papers with the sharp, unpleasant attention of a man who recognized institutional formatting. Olivia looked from me to our mother, and for the first time all evening, her face was blank. Truly blank. "Stop," my mother said. It came out barely above a whisper. I looked at her then. Really looked. Her lipstick was perfect. Her earrings caught the candlelight. Her spine was still straight. But the room no longer belonged to her. "For 26 years, I said, and my voice did not shake, you told people I was not your real daughter. These records say otherwise." No one interrupted. No one rescued them. That was the part one had not dared to imagine clearly enough beforehand. The silence itself. The complete social silence. My father reached for the top page, but I placed my hand over it first. Not aggressive. Just firm.
"There is more," I said.
Then I took out the footprint card and set it beside the others. Tiny inked newborn feet under hospital identifiers. Beside maternal information. Beside the name they had spent my life trying to unpair from mine. I did not need to explain it. I could feel the table understanding all at once. Patricia stared at the card like it had risen from the dead. Olivia's mouth parted slightly, then closed again. The retired judge cleared his throat, but did not speak. Aunt Linda had tears in her eyes and looked like she hated herself for not being surprised. My father finally said, "This is a family matter." And maybe if he had said it an hour earlier, in that warm room under the roses and candlelight and the heavy blessing of social hierarchy, everyone would have nodded. But now the words sounded what they always had been.
Small.
Defensive.
Late.
I looked down the length of the table at the faces that had listened to them for years. Then I looked back at him and said the truest thing I had ever spoken in that room.
No.
You made it a family matter. The hospital made it a fact.
For A.
Few seconds after I said it, nobody at the table seemed to remember how dinner worked. No one reached for glass. No one adjusted a napkin. Even the waitstaff at the edge of the room hesitated in that careful professional way people do when they sense they have just stepped into something private and irreversible. My mother was the first to move, but only barely. She placed her napkin down beside her plate with a precision that looked almost violent in its restraint. "Savannah," she said, and my name in her mouth sounded unfamiliar now, stripped of its usual managerial smoothness. "Put those away." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I could see the gap between her control and her truth. She was not confused. She was not wounded by some misunderstanding. She was cornered by something documented. My father tried next. Of course he did. Daniel Blake had built an entire life on stepping in at the exact moment authority began to slip. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward just enough to suggest calm without admitting urgency. "This conversation," he said, "is not appropriate for a public setting." I almost smiled at the choice of words. Public setting. As if my life had not been narrated in public for 26 years. As if the room itself had not been selected precisely because it reflected well on them. I touched the top page again, not protectively, not theatrically, just to keep the truth physically in place while they searched for a better version of events. "That would be more convincing," I said, "if you had kept the lie private." Aunt Linda covered her mouth with her fingers. Nolan looked down at his plate like a man trying not to become visible. Olivia still had not fully rearranged her face. That was what struck me most about her in that moment. She was not furious first. She was lost. The mythology had cracked in front of witnesses, and she had no idea what expression belonged to her anymore. "There has to be context," she finally said, looking at our parents, not at me. "Right?" No one answered her. That silence said more than anything else could have. My mother straightened in her chair. "I will not be ambushed at my own anniversary dinner," she said. There. It was again. Not denial of the records. Not immediate outrage that the documents were fake. Just offense at timing. Offense at presentation. Offense at losing control of the room in front of people who mattered to her. Something in me settled. All the way then. Because even with the table watching, even with the records right there in candlelight, she still could not make herself do the one thing a person wrongfully accused would do without being asked. Tell the truth clearly. My father's eyes shifted to the retired judge, then to Nolan's parents, then back to me. Calculating. Always calculating. "Savannah," he said, lowering his voice as if intimacy could still rescue him, "whatever you think you found, this is not the place." "I do not think I found anything," I said. "I found certified records." He exhaled once through his nose. Tiny. Controlled. I had seen that gesture my whole life. It was what he did when a subordinate in a meeting said something inconvenient, and he needed to remind himself that composure was more useful than honesty. "Records can be incomplete," he said. "Historical files can be misleading without the full circumstances." "Then explain the circumstances," I said. Not sharply, not loudly, just plainly. The room held its breath. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at my mother. Olivia stared between them like she was watching two people suddenly speak a language she had assumed she already knew. And still, neither of them answered. I could feel the old version of myself somewhere behind my ribs, the younger self who would have panicked in that silence and rushed to fill it, apologized for the discomfort, softened the truth to make it easier for everyone else to digest. But that version of me had built her life around surviving their reactions. This version of me had brought proof. So I let the silence expand. It was astonishing what happened when I did. The room started telling the story for them. The retired judge's expression hardened into recognition, not of motive, but of format, of institutional clarity. Aunt Linda began to cry quietly, the way women cry when something they have tolerated too long finally becomes impossible to rename as misunderstanding. Nolan's mother looked at Patricia with the cool alarm of someone recalculating what kind of family her son was marrying into. Even the church, Friends, people who had spent years smiling through my parents' carefully curated phrasing, now seemed unable to locate the old, comfortable interpretation. Because paper had done what emotion never could. It had forced scale back into the truth. My mother reached for her glass of water and missed the stem on the first try. It was a tiny thing, barely noticeable, but I noticed. She had always been so exact with her hands. "I do not owe this room an explanation," she said at last.
No, Olivia.
"You owe me one." She flinched, not outwardly enough for anyone else, maybe. But I saw it. My father moved immediately to cover. "We have given you a home, support, opportunities," he said. The sentence was so familiar it almost made me tired. Even now, even here, he wanted to convert my identity into debt again. To take this moment, this one clear, uncontestable moment, and drag it back into gratitude. I shook my head once. That is not what this is about. Then what is it about? Olivia asked suddenly, and this time she was looking at me. There was no breezy superiority left in her voice. Only strain. "What do you want?" It was such an honest question that for a second I almost hated her for being the one to ask it. Because beneath all the years of smugness and thoughtless cruelty, she had found the center before either of our parents had. "What do you want?" Not a scene. Not revenge. Not tears. "What do you want?" I looked at the records spread across the table. At my mother's name. At the tiny newborn footprint card. At the years between that ink and this room. "I want you to stop telling people I am not your real daughter," I said. Every word landed clean. I want it to end tonight. Completely. No more jokes. No more vague stories. No more elegant little lies in public. If anyone asks again, the answer is the truth. My mother stared at me as if I had spoken in a language beneath her social standing. My father's jaw tightened. "You are making demands," he said. "I am setting a boundary," I answered. "There is a difference." Again silence. I could almost feel the room shifting around the distinction.
Boundary.
Not breakdown. Not threat.
Boundary.
The retired judge finally spoke, his voice dry and measured. "Daniel," he said, "if the records are authentic, I would strongly advise against saying anything further tonight that contradicts them." It was not a moral statement. It was a practical one. And somehow that made it stronger. My father turned toward him with visible irritation, the first crack in the evening that was too sharp to be mistaken for elegance. "This is a personal matter." It stopped being merely personal when it was repeatedly represented socially, the judge replied. And I believe everyone at this table understands that. Patricia closed her eyes for one brief second. When she opened them, she looked older. Not because of lighting. Because performance was expensive, and hers was failing. "You do not understand," she said, and for the first time all evening the sentence sounded less like control and more like plea. I waited. Maybe everyone did. A whole room leaned unconsciously toward the possibility that she might finally say something real. But she did not finish the thought. She just sat there, lips pressed together, trapped between confession and image, and chose image one more time. That was the moment any remaining softness in me changed shape. Not vanished. Changed. Because I realized I was no longer waiting for repentance. I was observing refusal. There is freedom in that distinction. I gathered the pages neatly into one stack, then paused and left the top certified copy visible on the table between us. Not for drama. For clarity. "I am not staying to help you manage this," I said. "I am not going to comfort anyone in this room for being shocked by something I have lived with my entire life. But hear me carefully. If either of you tells this lie again to anyone for any reason, I will correct it every single time. Publicly, if needed." My father began. "Savannah, do not threaten us." I picked up my bag and stood. "It is not a threat," I said. "It is notice." The word landed with a stillness I could feel all the way down my spine. Notice. Not rage. Not chaos. Not revenge. Procedure. Boundary. Consequence. The language of systems. The language they had never expected me to bring home to their table. I looked once at Olivia. Her eyes were wet now, though whether from humiliation, confusion, or the first real fracture in the story she had inherited? I could not tell. I looked once at Aunt Linda, who gave me the smallest nod through tears. Then I looked at my parents. "You do not have to call me daughter," I said. "But you are done pretending I was never yours." And with that, I turned and walked out while the entire table remained silent enough to hear the sound of my own heels on the polished floor. The doors of the country club closed behind me with a soft cushion sound that felt almost obscene after the silence I had just walked out of. Not a slam. Not a cinematic rupture. Just a quiet, expensive click, like the building itself had been trained never to show strain. The night air hit my face cool and clean, and for a second I simply stood there on the front steps with my bag on my shoulder and my heartbeat moving through me in slow, deliberate waves. I had imagined that moment so many ways in the week leading up to it. I had imagined shaking,
Crying.
collapsing into the kind of delayed grief people in movies are always having at exactly the right emotional volume. But what I felt first was not collapse. It was silence. Not the punishing kind I had grown up with. A different silence. Spacious.
Meaning.
I walked to my car, unlocked it, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. My hands rested in my lap. The dashboard glowed faintly. Somewhere across the parking lot, laughter drifted from another event on the property, some separate celebration untouched by mine. Life continuing in adjacent rooms. I looked at my reflection in the dark windshield and did not recognize my face at first. Not because I looked transformed, because I looked steady. And steadiness had always been the thing my family mistook for surrender. My phone lit up before I even backed out of the parking spot. Olivia. Then my mother. Then my father. I let all three calls ring out. The screen dimmed. Lit again. Aunt Linda this time. Then an unknown number I guess belonged to one of my father's clients, or maybe Nolan's mother, making the kind of concerned contact people make when they want details, but intend to disguise it as compassion. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and finally started the engine. The drive home felt almost unreal in its normalcy. Stoplights still cycled. Gas stations still glowed. A teenage cashier at the 24-hour pharmacy near my apartment was leaning on the counter scrolling through his phone when I passed, untouched by the fact that an entire family mythology had just cracked open 15 minutes away. I kept thinking I should feel devastated. Maybe I was. But devastation can come dressed in strange clothes. Sometimes it looks like numbness. Sometimes it looks like breathing more easily than you have in years, and then hating yourself for the relief. When I got home, I set my keys on the counter, took off my heels, and stood barefoot in the kitchen while the apartment hummed around me. Refrigerator.
Étingement.
The tiny mechanical noises of a life I had made myself. My phone kept vibrating. I ignored it until nearly midnight. Not out of cruelty. Out of self-preservation. I knew my parents too well to mistake immediacy for sincerity. If I answered right away, they would still be in performance mode. Still trying to contain, revise, minimize. I was not going to spend one more night helping them reshape something they had already deformed for 26 years. So instead I made tea I did not really want, sat on the couch with the cream-colored envelope Grandma Ruth had given me, and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, written in her neat slanted script across 3 pages of pale stationery. Savannah, if you are reading this, then I imagine something long hidden has finally come into the light. I do not know what your parents will say when that happens. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for all the years when I knew enough to worry and still not enough, or not bravely enough, to stop what was happening to you. That sentence alone nearly undid me. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was honest. Honest in a way my family had almost never allowed themselves to be. The letter went on. She wrote that she had always believed my mother's treatment of me had less to do with doubt and more to do with resentment. That Patricia had changed after I was born. Quieter at first, then sharp, then obsessed with appearances in a way that only intensified as Daniel's business grew. She wrote that there had once been whispered tension around my birth, around timing, around stress, around something deeply personal my mother refused to discuss openly. But Ruth never learned enough to name it with certainty, and she would not invent certainty now. What mattered, she wrote, was not the private motive she could only guess at. What mattered was that adults with power had chosen to build a false story around a child who depended on them. Near the end, there was one sentence I read 3 times before it fully entered me. You were never hard to love. You were only inconvenient to the version of life they wanted to display. I lowered the letter into my lap and cried then. Quietly. Not with the jagged desperation I had expected all week. Just tears moving out of me while the apartment stayed still. Because there it was. Not a motive, not a confession, not even the full explanation I had once thought I needed. Just a sentence truer than anything my parents had ever offered. I was not difficult. Not defective. Not the almost child at the edge of the family portrait. I had been inconvenient to their image, and they had made me pay for that with my identity. By morning, the fallout had already started. My phone held 2 voicemails from my mother, 1 from my father, 3 texts from Olivia, and 1 message from Aunt Linda that simply read I should have said something years ago. I am sorry. My mother's first voicemail was controlled, almost eerie in its effort to sound wounded but dignified. Savannah, I do not know what you think you accomplished tonight, but humiliating your family in public was cruel. Her second was less polished. You had no right to do that without speaking to us first. That line almost made me laugh from sheer disbelief. No right. As if rights had ever been distributed equally in our home. My father's voicemail was shorter. Call me before this goes any further. Not are you all right? Not we need to talk. Not I owe you an explanation. Just control. Containment.
Tria.
Olivia's messages were a progression. First confusion. Then anger. Then something shakier. What was that? Mom is a mess. Dad says this is more complicated than you know. Then an hour later, did you really not know? And finally, near 2 a.m, one sentence that told me more about her than anything else had in years. I do not know what is true anymore. I stared at that message for a long time. Not because I felt responsible for comforting her. I did not. But because it was the first completely honest thing I had ever heard from Olivia Blake. At church the next morning, which I did not attend, my parents apparently encountered the first consequence they could not charm out of existence. Aunt Linda later called me and, after crying for a full minute before saying anything useful, told me that several people who had been at the dinner had either gone politely distant or directly cold. The retired judge had left early, without having dessert. Nolan's mother had asked Patricia, in a voice so controlled it frightened everyone, whether she had spent years publicly lying about her own child. Daniel's oldest client had made some excuse about an early morning tea time and left before coffee. Small things. Social things. But people like my parents built their entire emotional economy around social things. Approval. Reputation. The illusion of effortless credibility. Once those began to slip, everything else in their posture started to look more fragile too. By Sunday afternoon, my mother still had not denied the documents outright to anyone who had seen them. That mattered. She was upset, offended, heartbroken by the spectacle, according to Olivia. But she was not denying the records. My father tried to frame the evening as a painful misunderstanding born of private historical complexity, which is the sort of phrase men like him use when they need language broad enough to hide inside. But apparently, that was not landing the way it once would have. People had seen the seals, the pages, the way Patricia froze, the way Daniel shifted from correction to containment without ever once clearly saying the documents were false. Even performance has tells when it gets cornered. Monday at work felt almost surreal. I expected to feel exposed somehow, as though everyone could see the outline of what had happened through my skin. But nobody at the hospital knew. Nobody cared. My supervisor asked whether I could review a delayed release issue before lunch. A nurse from pediatrics thanked me for fixing a misfiled consent form. I bought yogurt from the vending area and listened to 2 residents argue about cafeteria coffee. The normalcy was not insulting anymore. It was stabilizing. Because it reminded me that my family's story had never been the whole world, only the world they trained me to orbit. Around noon, Megan Whitmore emailed me from her work address with a single line. I hope you are all right. Retain the certified copies somewhere secure.
No signature flourish.
No questions. Just practical care. I appreciated that more than I can say. That evening, after work, I visited Grandma Ruth. I did not know how much she had been told, but when I walked into her den, she looked at my face and nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. It is done, she said softly. I sat beside her and took her hand. It is done.
We did not talk much after that.
We did not need to. At one point, she squeezed my fingers and said, Your mother called me. I turned to her. What did she say? Ruth's mouth thinned at one corner. She said you embarrassed her. The old reflex rose in me, that instinctive shame children carry even after they know better. But then Grandma Ruth added, and I told her embarrassment is what happens when image and truth meet in public. I laughed then. Actually laughed. A short, startled sound that turned into something warmer. Grandma Ruth smiled faintly and leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking not older but lighter. How did she take that?
I asked.
Poorly, she said. Which, in this case, is probably a good sign. As I drove home that night, I realized something I had not let myself think yet. I had expected the aftermath to feel like loss. And in some ways it did. Whatever fantasy had remained about one day being quietly acknowledged, gently folded into the family without having to drag the truth into light, that fantasy was gone now. But in its place was something far more solid. For the first time in my life, the burden of explanation had shifted away from me. I was no longer the one carrying confusion while they carried authority. They were the ones facing rooms full of people who now knew enough to ask better questions. And whether they answered those questions honestly or not, the axis had changed. Not because I won an argument, because the truth had finally stopped being lonely. 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner, I was standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday night, rinsing blueberries in a metal colander, when my mother called, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel anything urgent when I saw her name. Not dread. Not anger. Not that old reflexive tightening in my chest that used to happen whenever Patricia Blake reached for me through a phone line. Just recognition. Like seeing rain in the forecast after you have already bought an umbrella. I let it ring once.
Twice.
Then I answered. Hello. There was no greeting on her side. Only a breath and then, I need to speak with you.
Need.
Not would like. Not can we talk.
Need.
Some habits survive humiliation. I leaned against the counter and watched water bead and roll across the blueberries under the faucet. You are speaking. A pause. I could picture her reacting to my tone, not because it was rude, but because it was no longer available for management. This cannot continue, she said. People are talking. I closed my eyes for half a second. There it was. Still. Even now. Not I hurt you. Not I lied. Not what I did to you was unforgivable. People are talking. Yes, I said. That tends to happen after the truth comes out. Her exhale sharpened. You are being cold. I almost laughed, but not from humor. From clarity. Cold. That was the word people like my mother used when warmth no longer bent in their direction. No, I said. I am being clear. She did not know what to do with that. I could hear it in the space that followed. Then she tried another route, one I knew almost before she took it. There were things you did not understand as a child, she said. There were pressures. Circumstances. Circumstances. The same old architecture. Fog instead of fact. Pressure instead of accountability. Then say them plainly. I replied. Tell me the circumstances plainly. Silence. A long one. Long enough that the refrigerator kicked on beside me, and the sound seemed to underline everything she would not say. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, less polished. You were born at a very difficult time. I waited. That is not an explanation, I said. It is the beginning of one. Another pause. Then, finally, something closer to honesty than anything she had ever offered. Your father and I were struggling, she said. Financially, socially, emotionally. You were not planned. There were rumors at the time, ugly ones, and her voice faltered, then tightened again. I felt like I was losing control of my life. I stood there with one hand resting on the edge of the sink and let the sentence settle.
Not because it satisfied me.
Because I had chased motive for so long that hearing even this partial, selfish, insufficient version of it felt like opening a locked room and finding exactly what you feared would be inside. Not monsters. Weakness. Vanity. Cowardice dressed in expensive clothing. So you decided to act like I was not really yours, I said quietly. I did not decide it that way, she snapped, too quickly. Things evolved.
Evolved.
As if cruelty were weather. As if repeated public erasure simply drifted into being on its own. No, I said. It did not evolve. You and Dad repeated it until it became the family script. My mother did not deny that. That mattered. People think closure arrives with tears or apologies or some cinematic confession that rearranges the past into a shape you can live with. But often closure is much smaller and much sadder. It is hearing the person who hurt you speak just enough truth to confirm that they were never confused. Only selfish. What do you want from me? She asked then, and I heard it at last. Not power. Not outrage. Fatigue. The fatigue of someone whose image has become too expensive to maintain. I turned off the faucet and set the blueberries on a towel. I already told you, I said. I want the lie to stop. Completely.
It has stopped, she said.
Good, I answered. Then keep it that way. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. Not because I was shattered. Because I was noticing what was missing. The old ache to chase her. The old hunger to make her understand me properly. The old need to pull one more ounce of truth from a woman who had built her life around withholding it. Those things were not gone completely. Healing is rarely that dramatic. But they were weaker now. Manageable. Like radio static after you find the correct station. A few days later, my father asked to meet for coffee. Public place. Predictable. Safe. In the way men like him prefer safety, neutral ground with witnesses just close enough to keep everyone civilized. We met at a cafe near his office, one of those polished downtown places with reclaimed wood tables and pastries too pretty to want. Daniel arrived exactly on time, in a navy coat and a look of controlled exhaustion that might have moved me once. Not anymore. He sat down, removed his gloves, and said, "Your mother is struggling." I looked at him over my cup. I struggled for 26 years. He flinched, almost invisibly. That was another new thing. The truth had started reaching him before he could prepare for it. I am not here to argue, he said. I am here to say that mistakes were made.
Mistakes.
I nearly smiled at the corporate neatness of it, as if my childhood had been a filing error. That is a small word for a long decision, I said. He looked out the window for a moment, jaw set, then back at me. We thought distance would simplify things. For who? I asked. He had no answer ready. That told me more than anything he might have said. He stirred his coffee once, though he had not added sugar. Your mother never adjusted after you were born, he said carefully. There was stress, expectations, some resentment I should have handled differently. Instead, I managed around it. Managed around it. That was the most Daniel Blake phrase imaginable. Not protected. Not corrected. Managed around it. He had seen the cruelty and chosen administration over intervention. Image over child. Ease over truth. You let her do it, I said. He looked at me steadily, and for once did not hide behind tone. Yes, he said. It was the first clean answer either of my parents had ever given me. Just yes.
No de queraschen.
No excuse wrapped around the edges. I wish I could say that hearing it changed everything. It did not. One honest syllable cannot restore a childhood. But it did something else. It stopped me from wasting any more imagination on whether he understood the harm. He had. He simply chose not to stop it. After that, there was not much left to clarify. We talked logistics, not feelings. I told him I wanted no more distorted stories circulating through family events, church circles, business dinners, or wedding planning. I told him that if Olivia had questions, he could answer her honestly, without using me as the emotional buffer. I told him I would decide for myself, event by event, whether I attended future gatherings. He listened like a man in a legal meeting, which somehow made the whole thing easier. I no longer needed tenderness from him.
Precision would do.
When I left the cafe, he stood as if he might hug me, then seemed to realize that gestures without history can feel insulting. So he only said, "I was wrong." I looked at him for a moment. The sidewalk behind him was full of strangers moving through lunch hour, none of them aware that one man's belated sentence had just arrived 2 decades too late. "Yes," I said. Then I walked away. In the months that followed, my family changed in the way systems change after exposure. Not beautifully, not all at once, but measurably. My mother stopped telling the story entirely, which was not the same as repentance but was still a boundary holding. My father became quieter at public events, less expansive when discussing family, as if he no longer trusted the old script to protect him. Olivia sent me a message one evening that simply read, "I am sorry for the things I repeated when I did not ask questions." It was not enough to erase anything, but it was real enough to keep. Nolan's parents, I heard through Aunt Linda, had postponed some wedding decisions until everyone had space, which in family language meant the social aftershock had not fully settled. Aunt Linda herself started calling me every Sunday, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to ask if I had eaten. Small things. Ridiculous things, maybe, to anyone who has not lived inside deprivation, so polished it was mistaken for refinement. But I noticed them. I noticed who moved closer, once the truth no longer carried social risk. I noticed who stayed away because proximity to honesty made them uncomfortable. That, too, was information. Grandma Ruth passed quietly in early spring. By then the trees had just started showing that faint first green that looks almost imaginary after winter. At her funeral, I stood in a simple black dress beside the woman who had kept the first fragile pieces of my reality when everyone else was invested in my confusion. My mother cried. My father kept his head bowed. Olivia held Nolan's hand. And I, strangely, felt calm. After the service, when the flowers were starting to wilt in the sunlight and people were gathering coats and casseroles and condolence phrases, Aunt Linda pressed something into my hand. It was the old bassinet card from Ruth's blue tin, sealed in a small protective sleeve. Mother P.
Blake.
Infant. Baby girl Blake. I stared at it for a moment, then slipped it into my purse with more care than anyone there could have understood. That night I went home, opened the drawer of my bedside table, and laid everything inside together. The certified copies. Ruth's letter. The photograph from the hospital room. The bassinet card. Not on display. Not arranged as a shrine to pain. Just stored where I could reach them if I ever needed reminding. Then I closed the drawer. That simple act mattered more than I expected, because for months those documents had been tools. Proof. Shields. Instruments sharp enough to cut through a lie. But as the drawer slid shut, they became something else.
Meaning.
Not evidence for battle. Not ammunition. Just part of my history, finally returned to the right name. Sometimes people ask, when they hear a story like mine, whether I forgave my parents. I do not think that is the most honest question. The better question is whether I still live inside the version of me they created. And the answer to that is no. I do not wake up each morning wondering whether I was difficult to love. I do not sit at tables anymore and accept being turned into an anecdote for someone else's comfort. I do not confuse politeness with truth. My parents spent 26 years telling people I was not their real daughter. But in the end, the deepest damage was not in what they told other people. It was in how long they made me doubt myself. The hospital record did not give me a family. It gave me back my own name. And once I had that, once I could finally see the difference between being unwanted and being lied about, everything changed. Because being treated as disposable was never proof that I was less. It was only proof that the people handling me lacked the courage to face what was real. I was always theirs. More importantly now, at last I am fully my own.